your cable or satellite provider. Congressman Adam Schiff is the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. He says it's too early to talk about a presidential impeachment. In an interview with Christian Science Monitor reporters this morning, he discussed the special counsel's Russia investigation and his own committee's investigation of Russian collusion.
I had 2 hours of sleep before Meet the Press, which is really dangerous. But the result is, I woke up in the middle of the night last night and I was like wide awake. I'm like, well, I might as well read. So I can't get back to sleep.
Exactly. All right, well, it's 9 o'clock. Hi, Philip. So I think we'll start here. Good morning. I'm Linda Feldman, Washington Bureau Chief of the Christian Science Monitor. Our guest today is Democratic Representative Adam Schiff of California, Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. This is his 6th appearance at a Monitor breakfast, so welcome. First, a little bit of background. Chairman Schiff earned degrees from Stanford and Harvard Law School and worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles before his election to the California State Senate in 1996. In 2000, Mr. Schiff was elected to Congress from California's 28th District and has won re-election ever since. He was named ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee in 2015 and now chairs the committee. In his spare time, Mr. Schiff is a triathlete and was the only member of Congress to compete in the inaugural Nations Triathlon in Washington, D.C. in 2010. And now for the ground rules. We're on the record here. Please, no live blogging or tweeting. In short, no filing of any kind while the breakfast is underway. There's no embargo when the session ends at 10 a.m. We will email pictures and a rough transcript from this breakfast to all the reporters here as soon as the breakfast ends. And as you know, if you'd like to ask a question, please send me a signal, and I will call on as many of you as time permits. Now, Congressman Schiff, if you'd like to make brief opening remarks, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to join you again. Thanks for coming to meet me this morning. So in terms of opening remarks, I don't think I'm likely to make the news that the Speaker did yesterday with her comments, but I would like to start with something that concerns me greatly at the moment, and that is what the Justice Department's plans are both for the Mueller report as well as the underlying evidence. And I say that because of a couple things. The first was a statement made by the then Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein that it's the department policy not to provide information to Congress or to the public about individuals who are not indicted. There was a fair amount of speculation after he made those comments as to whether he was voicing an opinion for things to come, whether this was a trial balloon by the Justice Department. We may have seen a more substantial indication that the Justice Department may take a restrictive view of what it can share with either the Congress or the public. In an interview recently given by 2 anonymous Department of Justice sources for ABC, in which the Justice Department sought to make the case that if it chose not to provide these materials to Congress, that it would not be a double standard. Yeah. But make no mistake, it would be a graphic double standard if the Justice Department decided that the public interest merited providing extensive discovery to the Congress during the last session in the Clinton email investigation and indeed in the Mueller investigation. But the public interest did not warrant its doing so when it came to requests made from a Democratic Congress on the same topic, or more specifically on the Mueller investigation. And the Justice Department sought to distinguish these circumstances in 2 ways. One, by saying effectively that it's James Comey's fault, and second, that because the provision of materials even after the Mueller report is submitted, the underlying provision of the underlying evidence to Congress could interfere with ongoing investigations carried on by other elements of the Justice Department that was a further reason why it ought to adopt a different policy than the one it did for the last 2 years. Neither of these arguments, in my view, hold water. First of all, the public interest in getting a full accounting of what Bob Mueller's been able to produce over the last two years is overwhelming. The public interest, the public need to know, is every bit as great, indeed, I would argue, far greater than it was in the email investigation, given that this is an investigation that goes to whether the president or people around him may be compromised by a foreign power. But second, to suggest that the enormous amount of discovery, as of June of 2018, more than 880,000 pages of discovery to the Congress, can somehow be attributable to James Comey is absolutely insupportable. Those documents were provided after James Comey was fired. And for the Justice Department to suggest that somehow it's his doing really undermines confidence in the department. It also, frankly, underscores just how much James Comey had to, his firing had to do with Russia, and how little it had to do with the discovery or statements or information he provided in the Clinton email investigation. In June of last year, I was notified in writing by the department. The director of the FBI testified in open session around that time as well, that in response to subpoenas that all post-dated James Comey leaving the Bureau, they had provided those 880,000 documents, and that discovery was ongoing. I would imagine that the discovery probably is well over 1 million pages at this point. So this is not something the department can lay at the feet of James Comey. It is, I would hope, a decision the department made over the last 2 years because it felt the public interest demanded it, and that outweighed its normal policy of not providing information in investigations where people are not indicted. To maintain that that is an ironclad policy, well, the department will have to explain that to Peter Strzok and Lisa Page and Hillary Clinton and Bruce Orr and the countless other individuals about whom the department provided discovery and who have not been the subject of indictment. But to make the claim also that providing the underlying materials might affect the ongoing investigation cannot be used to prohibit wholesale discovery because, of course, the Justice Department did provide documents in the ongoing investigation, including very sensitive documents like the FISA applications. That was not a bar to the department providing information to the Congress. But there's another compelling reason why the Justice Department needs not only to give the report to the public, but the underlying evidence to the Congress, and that is it will greatly facilitate our own investigation not to have to reinvent the wheel. If the department opts to adopt a new policy, opts to put forward a double standard and deprive the Congress of this evidence, it will mean that the Congress will have to recreate everything the Mueller investigation did, which will be enormously time-consuming and indeed, to some extent, not thoroughly possible. There is some evidence and documents and materials that are in the possession of the Justice Department that we will not have access to, no matter how thorough our own investigation may be. The searches that were conducted of Mr. Manafort or Roger Stone or perhaps others, those materials may be completely inaccessible or largely inaccessible to the degree that either the original materials or copies were provided back to those individuals. Nonetheless, the likelihood of our being able to obtain that evidence in its totality is very small, given the history with those individuals of tampering with witnesses or obstructing justice or failing to fully comply with our subpoena in the case of Roger Stone in the past. So the public interest, I think, compels this discovery. The necessity of the Justice Department appearing even-handed, no matter who controls the Congress, necessitates the provision of these materials. And while the department should obviously maintain its investigative interests, that cannot be held as an absolute bar to providing materials to the Congress. And finally, the Congress's interest and the public's interest in an expeditious investigation by the Congress will be severely inhibited if we have to retrace all the steps that the Mueller team took with far greater resources. So that is what I wanted to start the morning off with, and I'd be happy to go to your questions.
All right, well, I will kick it off with a question and then go around the table. And as for those of you who got here a little late, if you want to ask a question, just gesture and I'll put you on the list. So you mentioned the news yesterday of Speaker Pelosi's comment on impeachment. So I wanted to follow up on that. On CNN yesterday, you said that impeaching President Trump would only make sense with, quote, very graphic evidence. And I'm wondering if you could provide some credible examples of what you or the Mueller team might unearth that would be very graphic evidence that would push us toward impeachment. You've hired Daniel Goldman. Are you counting on him to come up with something that could take it to that level?
Well, I would say this. We have already seen deeply concerning evidence of the president's lack of fitness for office, the degree to which profound conflicts of interest may be guiding his foreign policy, as well as evidence of criminality on the part of the president as it pertains to the direction and coordination of an illegal campaign finance scheme in which there is documentary evidence as well as testimony that that scheme continued even while he was in the Oval Office by writing hush money payment checks, reimbursements to Michael Cohen. So it's fair to ask, you know, if that's the case, how much more does the Congress need than documentary and other evidence of criminality and very graphic evidence of certainly conflict of interest? And by that, I'm referring to the fact that the president was secretly pursuing a business deal in Russia, Moscow Trump Tower, through much of the campaign, concealing it from the public, seeking the Kremlin's approval to make that happen. At the same time, he was espousing a different policy towards Russia, more favorable policy towards Russia, at a time when the Kremlin's help, indeed Putin's approval, may have been very necessary for that project and all the money that the Trump family would make from that. But the reality is that the Republican members of Congress, with very few exceptions, have been utterly unwilling to stand up to this president in any way. We're going to have a vote soon in the Senate on whether the Congress will resist the president's effort to arrogate unto himself Congress's most significant power, next to the power to declare war, and that is the power of the purse. Perhaps even greater than the power to declare war, because the power to influence a war comes principally from Congress's power to defund a war. Very few Republicans in the House were willing to stand up to that obvious and unconstitutional act. How many will be willing to do so in the Senate remains to be seen. But thus far on these actions, there is very little willingness to even acknowledge the impropriety, let alone illegality, by members of the GOP. What will be necessary to make an impeachment a bipartisan process would have to be extraordinarily clear and compelling. I don't foreclose at the possibility that the Mueller investigation will produce that, or that our own will. but I think the Speaker is absolutely right. In its absence, an impeachment becomes a partisan exercise doomed for failure. And I see little to be gained by putting the country through that kind of wrenching experience. As I've often remarked in the past, the only thing worse than putting the country through the trauma of an impeachment is putting the country through the trauma of a failed impeachment. So this is an extraordinary remedy. The President may warrant it if the evidence is sufficient, but that bar is set very high by the Constitution and by the requirement of bipartisan support in the Congress.
I wanted, before I turn to other reporters, so a lot of Democrats seem to be pivoting away from the collusion narrative about President Trump and toward abuse of power and obstruction of justice, and you laid out some of the arguments there, but you're really more focused on the collusion piece, as I understand it. And I'm wondering if you can sort of articulate how your version of collusion/conspiracy differs from the ranking member on the committee, from Devin Nunes.
You know, I view, frankly, the collusion issue as a category of the issue of compromise. The interest of our committee, and indeed the origin of the Justice Department investigation, had to do with counterintelligence, had to do with compromise. If the Trump campaign played any role with the Russians in their interference in our election, that not only would be a crime, but it would also be deeply compromising of this president, because the Russians, being the other party to the transaction or to the conspiracy, could expose it at their time and place. So these are not disconnected. If the Trump campaign was working in coordination with the Russians, if the Trump organization was doing business with the Russians and had an economic interest, if anyone within the administration was deriving foreign funding for the inauguration or any other of its efforts improperly or illegally, all of this is within the category of compromise. On the issue of collusion, the reality is that there is ample evidence of collusion in plain sight, and it has been for a very long time. And of course, as the weeks have gone on, that evidence has continued to mount. What I think is challenging for the public is because it has come up in sequentially in pieces, it's hard to see the big picture. But when you look at the big picture, when you look at the Russians reaching out to the foreign policy advisor in 2016 and informing the foreign policy advisor that the Russians had possession of stolen Clinton emails, when you look at the meeting that followed not long thereafter in Trump Tower that was prefaced in writing by a representation that the Russian government was helping the Trump campaign, that they had dirt on Hillary Clinton, when you have the acceptance by the campaign, by the president's own son, of that help, when you had a meeting, an overt act in furtherance of that in Trump Tower, when you had all the lies about the meeting, when you have even more recent revelations about the campaign chairman, the Republican campaign chairman, providing polling data, and not top-line polling data, but evidently raw polling data to someone linked to Russian intelligence. All of this is evidence of collusion, and of course much, much more. The conversations between and communications between Roger Stone and WikiLeaks, the lies about those communications, all of this goes to the issue of collusion. Now, what I find equally troubling is the fact that the president was trying to profit from the Russians during the campaign. Indeed, the Moscow Trump Tower project, which, according to the special counsel's office, stood to make Donald Trump and his family hundreds of millions of dollars, that would have been the most lucrative deal of his life, was concealed from the public. The Kremlin's support was sought for that project. That is such a clear and present conflict of interest and danger to the country. And the president's response when the deception was revealed was, why should I miss out on that business opportunity because I might have lost the election? It may very well be the view of the President of the United States to this day that why should he miss out on the deal after he leaves office to make all that money from the Russians? After all, he might not get reelected. That would certainly explain this bizarre affinity he has for Vladimir Putin. It would certainly explain why he seems to be able to criticize everyone in the world, with the exception of Vladimir Putin, and I guess we'll have to add Kim Jong-un to the list. And so these issues are intermingled because they both represent different forms of compromise. On the collusion issue, as I've said from the very beginning, the crime is conspiracy. The reason why collusion is an important word is because it shouldn't be, the bar shouldn't be simply whether the President of the United States has committed a crime. Building a Trump Tower in Moscow may not be a crime, but if it's the possibility of making that money that is directing U.S. foreign policy, criminal or not, that is deeply antagonistic to our national security. So we will have to wait, Bob Mueller, to determine whether there was sufficient evidence of a conspiracy, even as it pertains to the president. Apparently the department's policy is that it's not indictable. But these strands are interwoven. You know, finally, I would say, in terms of different perspective between myself and the ranking member, you know, regrettably in the last session, the ranking member and many of the minority members of our committee viewed their job as not following the facts wherever they lead, but rather serving as part of the president's legal defense team. I hope that philosophy does not persist into this session. Looking at the way the government, the way the hearing went in the Oversight Committee, it certainly appeared that the GOP members of that committee were once again acting as surrogates for the president's defense team. I can't imagine Rudy Giuliani asking questions much differently than the GOP members of the committee did. But I think it's in the public interest that that we continue the commitment we made from the beginning, which is following the facts wherever they lead.
All right. To my left, Shirish Date from the Huffington Post.
Good morning.
Yesterday at the White House briefing, here's a question that was not asked. There's apparently a Chinese American businesswoman who has a string of massage parlors and who is openly selling access to the president to Chinese officials and businessmen. It didn't even come up at the briefing because it didn't rank to news of the day. If you don't impeach the president, does everything he does up to and including that, is that just okay behavior for the next president and the president after that?
Well, first of all, whether the president is impeached or not, no. I mean, none of the president's conduct, none of the lack of ethics or the lack of decency is somehow now okay. And I also think that it's very important that any issues, any allegations of corruption be investigated, be exposed. Now, we don't know in advance what the remedy might be in advance of doing the investigative work. But I do think that where there are credible allegations of corruption, or allegations that they're selling influence out of massage parlors in Florida, those issues ought to be looked into. And if there's corruption, it needs to be exposed. And if there are individuals responsible that have violated the law, they need to be prosecuted. The challenge that we have, you saw on display in that press conference, and of course, part of the reason you couldn't get to that question is the White House has largely stopped doing press conferences. Honestly, it's a difficult balance whether you conduct press conferences if all you're going to do is disseminate false information. I do think that there are a myriad of serious allegations of impropriety that the members of the press have to wrestle with. You know, what do we prioritize when we have a chance to ask a question of Sarah Huckabee Sanders? Similarly, the Congress has to prioritize and decide, okay, we can't look into everything. What are the most important things for us to look into? One of the issues that I keep coming back to, even though it is not an issue before the Intelligence Committee, but as someone who co-founded, along with Mike Pence, the Caucus on Freedom of the Press, is very near and dear to my heart. And that is, last year we learned that the president was secretly meeting with the Postmaster General, apparently in an effort to browbeat the postmaster into raising postal rates on Amazon as a way of punishing Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post. More recently, we got some confirmation of concern that I expressed last year as well, and that is, was the president seeking to hold up the merger of the parent of CNN as a way of punishing CNN? Well, it was reported about a week ago that, in fact, he had instructed members of his staff to tell the Justice Department to hold up that merger. And if either one of these allegations are true, it is the most flagrant abuse of power. It means that in addition to rhetorically bashing the press as the enemy of the people and providing an example for despots around the world to bash their media, an example they are following, that the president is using the instruments of state power to punish the media. Where does that rank next to other issues? And so we are very much wrestling with that and doing our best to prioritize in the same way that it's necessary in those rare opportunities that you have to ask the White House questions that you have to prioritize.
To your left, Jeff Earl from the Daily Mail.
Hi.
Since we're on that topic, I mean, I think I see where you're going, but it sounds like you are saying that, I mean, you said in the past that as part of your wide-reaching investigation, you want to look at financial influence of foreign actors. So is this massage parlor situation and this Li Yang woman, is that something your committee is probing, should probe? Are you dedicating staff to it? And what do you hope to find? What do you need to find out if this is on the level?
As with most of these issues that touch many different committees, we will be conferring among the chairs and with our leadership about, where is this issue on the priority? Whose lane is this in terms of the committees? Is this an issue in which more than one committee should work jointly? And so at this point, I don't have the answer to that question. But, we are interested in more than Russian influence. It is also of deep concern to us. We've seen allegations of potential of Gulf money being used to influence either the president or members of his family. And regardless of the source in terms of the foreign nation, whether it's Chinese trademarks, or Gulf money, or the proposed tallest building, not just in Russia, but in all of Europe, Moscow Trump Tower, we have a profound interest in making sure that the policy of the United States is not up for sale to whoever offers the first family the most.
See, to your right, are you Andrew?
Yes.
Andrew Desiderio from Politico.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You have talked a lot over the last couple of weeks about this issue of making the Mueller report public. You led with it today. Obviously, it's really important to you. The House is voting this week on a non-binding resolution on making the Mueller report public and available to Congress. I know it's technically the Judiciary Committee's purview, but why do something non-binding when there appears to be bipartisan support for something that is binding, that would require the Justice Department to make those findings available to the Congress and to the public?
You would have to ask my colleague who's introduced the measure that question. I would say this, that I'm prepared, certainly, and I think many of my colleagues feel exactly the same way, that if the Justice Department or the Attorney General tries to withhold the report or the underlying evidence, to use whatever compulsion is necessary to make sure that this information is not buried, that the report is not buried. I would hope that we can gather strong bipartisan support for this resolution. You asked about difference in perspective between myself and Ranking Member Nunes. This is one very rare area of agreement. He has similarly said that he thought that both the report and the underlying evidence should be provided to Congress. There are any number of other Republicans who have likewise said, as it pertains to the Mueller report, that it should be made public. Now, I have to say, though, if past is prologue, this does not necessarily mean they will vote that way. You need look no further than Mitch McConnell to see that problem, given his urging the president that he should not declare an emergency and all the problems with that kind of a declaration, and how quickly he capitulated when the president decided nonetheless to do so. But I would hope that my GOP colleagues would stay true to their convictions, and because what they do will not only have a great impact on whether the truth is ever fully told, but it will have a great impact on future Congresses as well.
So right here, Tim Mack from NPR.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. I have a three-part question on relating to documents and records, and they should be rather quick for you to answer. Do you have a sense of when we can expect to see the Cohen transcripts? The second one is relating to what Cohen said in open testimony before oversight regarding that speakerphone conversation that the president had with Roger Stone. Is your committee pursuing communications records that might indicate whether such a call was ever made? And in your opening remarks, you referred to documents that may be inaccessible to you if your committee or Congress were expected to do investigations, like redo investigations that the Mueller investigation had already done. Are you aware of specific documents that will not be accessible to you that you're referring to?
In terms of the Cohen transcripts, we will be making a decision about what other witnesses we want to bring in on some of the topics that we cover with Mr. Cohen, and whether there would be any adverse impact to the investigation if we were to release the transcripts before those other witnesses are brought before the committee. So that will be our analysis in terms of timing. We would certainly like to release those transcripts as soon as we're able to, but at the same time, there may be evidence in those transcripts that would prejudice the investigation if we were to disclose before we did further investigative work. So
we can't anticipate seeing them anytime in the near future.
You know, I can't give you an estimate on timing until we've had a chance to really analyze the full content of the transcripts. As you know, we had 2 full days with Mr. Cohen. He continues to cooperate with the committee, and so at this point I can't tell you the timing, except that we would like to release them as soon as we're able. In terms of the conversations that Michael Cohen talked about in the open session that he overheard between Roger Stone and the president, where Stone was relating communications he was having with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Yes, that is a very important investigative thread. We are going to be and have been pursuing documents that will allow us to corroborate that testimony. So that remains one of the important investigative threads.
Specifically records of that call or communication? Meaning working with telecoms or asking?
I don't want to go into specifics, but we are going to be looking at any documentary evidence, and obviously that could take a number of phones, a number of forms, from phone records to social media records to other documentary evidence. We will be seeking, as with other witnesses, to be able to either prove or disprove what people have testified to. And then finally, in terms of evidence that the Justice Department may have that could very well be beyond the reach of Congress if the Justice Department decides not to follow the precedent it established over the last 2 years and make that information available to Congress. I would, put in that category materials allegedly obtained by the special counsel. There were reports of hard drives being seized and other physical evidence. You could also, though, include evidence that the special counsel has been able to obtain from witnesses that may be going to jail and are inaccessible to us. You could also include in that category information and evidence that the special counsel may have been able to obtain by virtue of having agents around the world, something that we do not have at our disposal. I would imagine there will be broad categories of evidence that would be exceedingly difficult for the Congress to obtain that is now in the possession of the special counsel.
I see to your right, Ginger Gibson from Reuters.
Chairman, there has been a lot of Republican talk about your time spent with Michael Cohen. They seem to have zeroed in on this as an attempt to discredit Cohen's testimony both before your committee and the Oversight Committee. Could you detail what conversations you had with Cohen, how long they were, what the nature of those conversations are, and respond to this ongoing Republican criticism about your contact with him?
The Republican strategy in the Oversight Committee seems to be discredit Michael Cohen. The Republican strategy in the Intel Committee seems to be why weren't we present at the proffer sessions with Michael Cohen? Ignoring, of course, that when they were running the investigation for the first 2 years, they had all kind of contacts with witnesses outside of our presence and didn't have a problem with doing so. In fact, dispatched their staff out of the country to interview witnesses without informing the minority. The reality is, in terms of my own communication, I had a brief phone call with my staff, Mr. Cohen, and his attorneys to encourage him to come and testify voluntarily and to try to allay the concerns that he had with the threats that he was receiving from the president, from the president's allies in the Congress and outside the Congress. We had a great desire to have him come in voluntarily and not under subpoena. If it were necessary to subpoena him, then there's always the risk that the witness decides not to cooperate, to take the fifth, or not provide information that's very pertinent to the investigation. So that was the extent of my communication with him, which was on the phone. Now, several Republicans, Mr. Meadows, Jordan, the president, and others have pushed out this false narrative that I spent 10 hours with Mr. Cohen. That's simply not true. And they know it's not true, but it makes for good Fox pundit commentary, and so they have pushed out this falsehood. But proffer sessions are done in every credible investigation. I'll point out that the special counsel's office, according to Mr. Cohen's open testimony, had 7 proffer sessions with Michael Cohen, undoubtedly far in excess of the duration of the staff proffer sessions that we had. And these are important to be able to make the interviews more efficient when they're conducted. But a large part of Mr. Cohen's proffer sessions involved his reviewing the transcripts from his prior testimony.
Jessica Stone from CGTN, Chinese television.
So it may not surprise you, Chairman, that I have a question about Huawei. I'm wondering twofold if you've seen anything in your role in the Intelligence Committee, not asking you to detail it, but have you seen solid evidence that Huawei is a national security threat to the United States? Not that it could be, but that it currently is. And secondly, just wanted to get your thoughts on the legislation and the executive order talk around ruling out Huawei being in any 5G in the United States or elsewhere.
I have profound concerns about Huawei and do believe that Huawei is a national security threat, particularly if it becomes integral and integrated into our 5G network or that of our allies. We did a bipartisan investigation of Huawei years ago and had the concern then, based on what we were able to learn. Those concerns have only heightened over the years since. While much of this I can't discuss publicly, I can say this. Huawei is not in a position to say no to the Chinese government. It owes its existence and livelihood and future profitability to staying in the favor of the Chinese government. And so if data is routed through China or data is accessible through Huawei technology, and the Chinese government asks for that with no showing, no probable cause, no interest in privacy, no nothing, Huawei must comply. That is not a circumstance, I think, that the United States or its allies should willingly put themselves in. So I have a profound concern about Huawei, its role in 5G, and the security and privacy vulnerabilities that would accompany that.
All right, to your left, Brian Bennett from Time Magazine.
Hi, Congressman. I wanted to ask you about what the U.S. saw on Russian influence in the 2018 midterm elections and what the U.S. is seeing in Russian intentions toward the 2020 elections.
What we saw in 2018 was a continuation of some of what we saw in 2016, in the sense that the Russian social media operation continued unabated to try to influence the American electorate, to try to continue to divide the American electorate. We saw limited efforts at spearfishing into some of the campaigns. We did not see the kind of hacking and dumping of documents, obviously, that we saw in 2016 repeated in 2018. I don't think that that reflects in any way a change in Russian behavior or attitudes, so much as the decision that the midterms are not as easy to influence as a presidential, that there was probably far more to be gained by interference in another presidential than risking the escalation of sanctions in advance of 2020. So I take no comfort from the fact that the level of interference in 2018 was less than 2016. I think we're enormously vulnerable in 2020. I think one thing we can be certain of is that under any estimation, the Russians will continue to seek to divide us, to exacerbate our divisions. That has really never stopped, and they've made no bones about it. One of my greatest fears in 2016 will be even more of a concern in 2020, and that is, in 2016, I was worried that among the authentic documents the Russians were dumping, that they would begin to dump forgeries, or that they would take real documents and alter the contents of a real document. And if you alter the contents of a real email between two real people, you'll be able to corroborate as truthful certain portions of that. Those two people exist. Those two people were in email communication. You can corroborate certain facts that are not forged in those two emails because they will resemble reality. And had the Russians done that in the weeks leading up to the election, it would have been impossible to disprove had they, for example, suggested the campaign was engaged in illegality. Now the Russians will have at their disposal deepfake technology, which will allow them not just to forge documents if they choose, but to forge audio tapes, to forge videotapes, to make a far more disruptive impact. And I think psychologists will tell you that even if you can disprove a fake video, if you can show it's a forgery, the negative impression watching it leaves you is never erased. It may be mitigated, but the damage is partially done and permanent. And so the potential for mischief now is extreme. Potential for mischief from domestic actors, but also from foreign actors. And it's really a technological race now to perfect deep fakes and to perfect the ability to detect deep fakes. But given how polarized our electorate is now, the ability to disprove a forgery is highly problematic, and the converse is also true. If damning evidence does come to the fore in the form of a videotape or an audio tape, the ability to write it off as a fake, even though it's real, is also difficult. And in this context, I have to say that I think one of the most destructive things that this administration has done is to propagate the idea that there is no such thing as truth anymore. That, as Giuliani said, truth isn't truth, or as Kellyanne Conway has said, they're entitled to their own alternate facts, and the kind of work that Sarah Huckabee Sanders does every time she takes the podium, where she tries to weave fiction into some alternate form of reality. That, I think, is among the most corrosive acts in terms of a democracy. And now with these new technologies and an electorate that is being acclimated to the idea that we're all entitled to different truths, makes our democracy very vulnerable.
Jeremy Herb from CNN.
After the Michael Cohen testimony in all three committees, there's been a lot of talk about where does your investigation go. Do you foresee bringing in Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump? Are they witnesses you want to bring back or bring in for the first time? And then separately, would you want to talk to Robert Mueller in your committee when he's done with his investigation?
In terms of witnesses we've brought before the committee in the past, we are examining that list, as well as a great many witnesses the Republicans refused to bring in the first place. And you'll see a mix of both. Obviously, Michael Cohen testified previously, and Felix Sater testified previously. Now, with Felix Sater, the Republicans scheduled his interview in New York at a time when we had votes. So none of the members were able to be present, and none of the members were able to evaluate the credibility of that witness. We obviously know more than we did the last time he was interviewed as well. So we are going through our witness list to prioritize, obviously, but also to determine which witnesses need to be brought back. A number of witnesses refused to answer whole categories of questions. And when we sought to get the then Republican majority to insist on answers, they were unwilling, which was a pretty good sign that they were not committed to following the facts. And so some of those witnesses are certainly going to have to come back. We will be working with the other committees to determine which committees they come back to, and whether, in the way we are doing joint document requests, we might consider joint testimony. I don't know if that will be practical because of the size of the committees, but we are doing our best to coordinate our efforts, particularly when they involve the jurisdiction of many committees. Oh, well, I think that if the Justice Department either attempts to conceal the Mueller report or the underlying evidence, then requiring Mueller to testify may very well be necessary. Whether that's before our committee, the Judiciary Committee, both committees, or other committees, will be the subject of discussion internally, determine what the most appropriate venue would be. There may be particular issues of interest and concern to the Intelligence Committee that are different from other committees, and so we certainly would not take that off the table.
So let me throw one in here. If Donald Trump is not reelected next year, should he be prosecuted? And if so, for what?
Well, you know, I think we can certainly say from the indictment in the Southern District of New York that identifies individual one as having directed and coordinated a campaign fraud scheme in which the department urged that Michael Cohen be sent to jail, that it's very difficult to make the argument that the person who was directed and was coordinated should go to jail, but the person who did the directing and did the coordinating should not. I don't think that's a supportable position. So I think that militates very strongly in favor of indicting the president when he is out of office, if the Southern District of New York has the evidence to prove the case against individual one who Michael Cohen identified as the president. And given the documentary evidence, the canceled checks, given the audio tapes, given the other witnesses who are cooperating with the special counsel, it certainly appears there's no shortage of evidence. And so if the Justice Department takes the position that cannot indict a sitting president, when that president is no longer sitting, then I think it has to consider whether it should hold a former president to a different standard than it holds everyone else. I will mention, too, that the Justice Department argued in the case of Michael Cohen that it was very important to establish the principle that the rich and powerful did not operate by a different set of rules, that precinct walking and phone banking was not simply something for the less rich or less powerful. And that argument applies with even greater force to Donald Trump than it did to Michael Cohen, obviously. And so I think that also militates in favor of making sure that no one escapes justice, including the President of the United States.
Thank you. I'll put you down for a yes.
Isn't that going to make him run even harder for re-election?
Well, you know, I'm sure that it has occurred to the president that there is a prospect that he may be indicted when he leaves office, and the longer he stays in office, and if he is able to avoid the statute of limitations by remaining in office, that is a consideration that has not escaped him. It is a reason, I believe, that the Justice Department policy against indictment is the wrong policy, particularly when there is any risk that the statute of limitations may allow a president to escape justice. When you look at the prior OLC opinions on whether a president can be indicted, they devote most of their argumentation, almost all of their argumentation, as to whether a president should be prosecuted while in office because of the degree to which it would interfere in the performance of his or her duties to have to appear in court and go through the whole process. Very little time is spent on the actual indictment and a deferral of prosecution. And the argument that is made against that is simply a reputational one, that it would place a stigma over the president. That stigma is already there by virtue of the indictment in the Southern District of New York, which essentially names the president as an unindicted co-conspirator. That intangible interest, the difference or delta between naming the president as an unindicted co-conspirator and indicting the president, the difference in that reputational impact compared to the risk that he could escape justice by waiting out the statute of limitations, I think militates strongly against a department policy that precludes indictment.
Just real quick, do you know what the statute of limitations is offhand as a prosecutor?
I do not know offhand what it would be on the variety of offenses that may be implicated in the campaign finance fraud scheme.
Jessica Mendoza from the Christian Science Monitor.
Just going back to that idea that you talked about earlier in terms of fake news and credibility, I'm curious, how do you make sure that any congressional investigation is perceived as credible enough by the public to have an impact, or a big enough impact? And how do you measure the impact of any investigation that you conduct?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, you know, the best way to do that is if you're able to work together in a bipartisan fashion in an investigation. That appears next to impossible in the House. I think the public got to see on graphic display in the open hearing with Michael Cohen in a way that it couldn't see with obviously the closed hearing before the Intel Committee. The radically different perspectives the parties have on this, or the degree to which the Republican Party has decided to go all in defending the president regardless of his conduct. And if the GOP decides that its agenda on taxes or judges or anything else is simply more important than its constitutional responsibility or the truth or ethics or morality, there's little that the Democratic Party can do about it in terms of compelling the GOP to work in a bipartisan way. So it's very difficult. I think it's all the more reason why the product of the investigation, why the process needs to be transparent and why the product of the investigation will need to be compelling and very graphic, because otherwise it's very difficult, I think, to gain broad public consensus around the findings of an investigation.
Is there any specific way that you guys can perhaps maybe not ensure that the product will be compelling and graphic, but in terms of the transparency of the process? I mean, it makes it sound as if no matter what Democrats do, if Republicans aren't on board, then that's sort of that.
I think that being as transparent as we can is important in terms of showing the evidence to the public. For that reason, we are going to be doing as much in open session in our investigation as we can. We could certainly have done the Felix Sater interview in closed session, but we are trying to weigh the investigative impacts, as I mentioned about the release of the Cohen transcript, with the need for transparency, the need for the public to see what's going on. Now, the public got to watch Michael Cohen's testimony in the Oversight Committee, and that's beneficial. And it could evaluate how the parties are approaching this. Were both parties really equally interested in the evidence he had to offer and finding corroboration or being able to prove or disprove? Or were there different motivations? And so that, I think, is valuable. The other thing is, what I think our goal ought to be is to find the facts, as many of them as we can, and then present them to the public. It's not our job to prove the president guilty of X or guilty of Y. It's our job to find out what the truth is and make it public whichever way it cuts. And so what I would anticipate in terms of our final work product and our final report is we'll set out what we found. And the public will have to draw its conclusion about what those facts mean. And that, I think, is what we ought to aim to do. And we can do that regardless of whether the GOP wishes to work with us or not.
So, okay, one more final question at the end of the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Ben Siegel with ABC.
Right.
You just spoke a little bit about the goals of your investigating. Can you clarify a little bit the timeline? These are very weighty topics and lines of inquiry, some of which this committee has not really investigated before. You've had to bring on staff with specialized experience. Is it possible in your mind that this is something that continues on beyond the next 2 years, potentially beyond the Trump presidency, if you haven't found all the facts yet?
Well, a lot will be impacted, as I mentioned before, by the degree to which the Justice Department makes us investigate everything Bob Mueller did all over again. And so that will have the most direct impact on the length of our investigation, how much the Justice Department is willing to share. There are certain areas that the Justice Department, though, and Bob Mueller may not have investigated at all. And probably the most significant example is the issue of money laundering. Were the Russians laundering money through the Trump organization? Is that leverage the Russians have over the president? Maybe Mueller has looked into that, maybe he hasn't, but there may be very well areas that represent potential compromise that have not been investigated by anyone, because the president has tried to draw a red line around it and say, thou shalt not look at this. So it won't be completely dependent on the level of forthcoming, the level the department is forthcoming, but it will be substantially impacted by that. I don't want to put a timeline on it, except to say that we feel a sense of urgency about it. We've always felt a sense of urgency about it. We'd like to do this as expeditiously as we can. We don't control the timing completely. As the White House counsel's response to Chairman Cummings' request for documents makes clear, the White House counsel intends to fight congressional oversight and likely stonewall it to the maximum degree. That was a very maximalist position the White House counsel took in answer to very legitimate oversight questions by the Congress. If, for example, on the issue of security clearances, which we have an interest in as well as the Oversight Committee, the White House tries to hide behind the generic Sarah Huckabee Sanders answer, we don't discuss security clearances, as a way of avoiding having to answer the question, did the president overrule the intelligence community and his own advisors and give his daughter and son-in-law clearance that they should not have received? If we have to fight to get answers to those questions, we'll fight to get answers to those questions. But of course, that will only delay our investigative work. But that has been the model for the administration with the Office of Special Counsel, and that is, for the last 2 years, as administration has stonewalled the Office of Special Counsel and refused to provide the president for interview to the Special Counsel, it has simultaneously attacked the Special Counsel's office investigation for taking too long, when much of the delay may be occasioned by actions of the administration itself. And I would expect, given the attacks it's making on our investigation and the other congressional investigations, which are a direct parallel to the attacks it's made on the Special Counsel, that we can expect the same treatment from the White House.
All right, well, we've reached the end of the hour, and thank you so much again for coming, and I hope you come again.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your having me.
Sure, great. Thank
you.
How are you? Hi. Wonderful to see you. It's been a long time.
Oh, yeah.
Source to see whether it's correct or it's not correct. And if you look at the time framework that we have made, you don't have the opportunity to research for 2 or 3 weeks to do this stuff. Very
Good to see you. Thank you. Thank you.
Easy resolution to the whole constellation of issues that were raised. It's a pleasure.
Give you my card so we can stay with it. Wow. Good to see you again.
I will say that